Hello, I'm Vivian. Welcome to our video about editing your essay for ASIA1030. When you're editing, it's usually very tempting to try and fix everything at once. For instance, if you're looking at your draft and you see lots of typos, you might be really tempted to fix them up first. But actually, that ends up potentially wasting a bit of time, because if you've got an essay where there are lots of typos, but you also realize that you need to delete sections or rearrange sections, if you spend the first while looking at the typos and the minor things, you might be working on a paragraph, for instance, that ends up being one that you decide to delete. So instead, what we suggest is following this 4-part editing process. So first of all, thinking about the most tricky things. So what's the argument? And is it logical? Is it a good argument? Is it clearly answering the question? Then focusing on the structure, thinking about whether you've actually answered the essay question in a logical order, whether the information that you've presented is enough to answer the question, whether you need extra paragraphs, whether you need to delete some, and so on. So what I'm going to talk you through is these 4 parts. So when you're editing for the argument, this is the thing that will take a bit of the hardest work, because it's the thinking work. It's thinking through, have you actually answered the question? Is it answering all parts of the essay question? Is it a consistent argument that you have? So check your introduction and check your conclusion. Are they making a consistent argument? Then think about your topic sentences, for instance. Do they actually help you to answer the question as well? And go back to the signposting in your introduction. Does it actually match the structure of your essay? So focus on that first of all, to make sure that you have actually answered the question that you've developed. Then it's time to think about the structure. And that's where you think about the overall outline of your essay. You might actually like to write up an outline of your essay, or just look at the topic sentences of your essay to ask yourself, is the argument coming out through each of the paragraphs in your essay? Are there any paragraphs that sound really descriptive? And if so, can you explain how they fit into the argument, or do they need to be moved around? Keep asking yourself, have you given enough evidence? Have you provided enough reasons to answer the essay question? And if you've presented any counter-arguments, do you leave yourself enough space to then rebut those counter-arguments and show why your argument is still valid, even though there might be some counter-arguments? And again, think about the signposting. Does it actually match that structure? After you've done that really hard work, then it's time for the more detailed work, thinking about your paragraphing. So when you're looking at the paragraphing, think about each paragraph as being one main idea. So ask yourself, does each paragraph have one main idea? Is that main idea shown in the topic sentence, and does it show the argument? And ask yourself whether they're fitting that 150 to 200 word ballpark. So think about whether you need to split paragraphs up, whether you need to combine them, and so on. Then get into the details about the evidence. Have you correctly cited it? Have you used enough? Have you used evidence to show your wide and critical reading in your essay? And think about your academic integrity. Is it accurate? Finally, edit for the expression. That's where you look into the really long sentences, when you look into the options for rephrasing sentences if they're awkward, for instance, reducing repetition, using a bit more of a range of vocabulary rather than repetitive vocabulary, and think about whether there's then any proofreading things that you need to fix up, typos, formatting, and so on. So by drilling down into those details, that can really help you to develop the clarity and the cohesion of the ideas. So when you are editing for expression, ask yourself about, is it clear? Is it cohesive? And one really good tip is to think about how sentences might be misinterpreted. So if we took this sentence, for example, the mudlark swooped a magpie and ruffled its tail feathers. Now, you might start getting confused when you get to the word its. So whose tail feathers were ruffled? Did the mudlark actually grab the magpie's tail feathers and ruffle them? Or was the mudlark fluffing up its feathers, for instance? And think about whether any of your statements can be misinterpreted, because when you're writing academic pieces, they can get very complicated very quickly. So you need to check and ask yourself, can it be misinterpreted? Because if it cannot be misinterpreted, then your reader will get confused. and they will be struggling to figure out, well, which interpretation do you want me to make? So rephrase when that's the case. Lack of clarity can often happen due to really long sentences, for example, or awkward phrasing. And this is one example where I have a really, really long sentence, which is confusing because it contains too much information, and then another sentence which doesn't quite connect to the same idea that was developed earlier. So when you've got long sentences, break them down into multiple shorter sentences, or split up the information into different parts. Think about the wording, whether you can change it to be simpler wording, reducing repetition, for example. And if you have awkward phrasing, try and just rearrange the sentence, put it in a different order, and see whether that makes better sense. So here's a revised version for clarity. So this is actually the students' original work. So what they've done is they've actually presented very complex ideas, but in 3 separate sentences, and they've explained the connections between the ideas. So that final one puts the idea about Suharto's declining health being used for a narrative about Suharto being unfit to rule. They've put that idea in context of the factors that they've looked at within that paragraph. So they've said it's even smaller factors, such as, so they're using that example as one among potentially many. And it relates back to the others, to the point about corruption, because that's one of the main factors about the complex narrative. So think about revising your work for clarity, spending a bit of time doing that. And in particular, look for words like it, these, those, they, those words that refer to something else. And they can create unclear examples in the kind that you see here. For instance, where you see the word it could refer to multiple things, and you don't know what it is. So that's particularly useful when you're moving from one paragraph to the next. If you start off a new paragraph where you're still referring back to the previous idea, tell your reader what that idea was. So actually remind them that you're talking about backlash, for instance, as this paragraph does. Also, make sure that your writing is cohesive. Show the connections between the ideas, because you can connect ideas in multiple ways. So there's connections in terms of order and logic, but you might also be contrasting ideas or clarifying or giving further information. And you might be signaling to your reader where you conclude an idea and move on to the next one. So those cohesive devices are quite important to show how the ideas all fit together. So look back over your work when you're editing it and go through it and check, have you used the appropriate cohesive devices? So ask yourself, am I bridging between ideas here? Am I telling the reader what is coming next? Or am I trying to smooth transitions? So when you're looking for expression, look at these kinds of things for clarity and cohesion. Also, when you have a draft of your work, it's useful to put it through the ASIA1030 practice site, where you can check whether it follows academic integrity. You might need to change the paraphrasing that you've done, for instance, if it's too close. There are examples on that website that show how to do that. So in sum, follow this editing process. Really focus on the difficult things first. So the argument first of all, then the structure, and then move on to the more detailed things like paragraphing and expression. There is more advice on your Wattle site, so head along there. And this wraps up the video in the series about writing your second essay. Best of luck, everyone. You can come and see us as well for more advice and personalised advice about your writing. So you can book appointments with the writing coaches who will give you one-on-one advice about your essay. So they are running Zoom appointments that you can access throughout semester. Okay, best of luck.